Thank you very much. It's a great privilege to stand in your presence. My name is Kehinde Soyemi. Background, I'm a public health physician, but I actually work within the pharmaceutical industry and a recent graduate of this prestigious university. One of the first set of students for the Masters of Management program. And basically, I'm just going to be presenting on my applied research project that was graciously supervised by Dr. Donald Jones. So just to basically kickstart it, I'm going to be talking about strategic alliance, the lessons we actually picked up from COVID-19 vaccines development. And this topic, basically for me, the reason why I decided to work on this topic was because for my background, I work in clinical research and drug development. And so I wanted to see how that interface with the management aspect of it, basically. And so just to kick started, sorry. Okay. Right. So this is basically what my outline looks like. It's just basically a summary of what I worked on and my experience within the field, basically. So if you look at, the problem basically that we are quite aware of, when COVID-19 came, there was lockdown, the impact within the global economy was, we had job losses, GDP were affected, people were tilted into poverty. Unfortunately, because of the disease, basically, you find out that there were a lot of things that were not clear. There were a lot of informations, that we were battling with. Part of the problem was the fact that, we had a situation whereby we had this global spread of the disease. There was the lockdown. We don't know how to manage this disease. The infectivity and the mortality associated with, this disease was also very high. And so the question is, how do we prevent the continuous spread of this disease? Now, within the pharmaceutical industry, there was the talk about developing vaccines. But unfortunately, if you're quite familiar with how vaccines are developed, we needed a quick vaccine. We needed it to be developed very fast. But what do we know? Within the biopharmaceutical industry, what you're probably aware of is the fact that we have mergers, we have acquisitions. Strategic collaborations were not something that is really, really very common within that aspect. Why? The competitive landscape was something that people looked at and they really don't want to go into that. And then when you look at, the processes involved in trying to work across borders, the regulatory compliance, market authorizations are things that really limit the collaborations. But we were actually saddled with a disease that was affecting the global economy and we needed a solution, really. And so, looking at how vaccines development usually take, if I should ask you within this context, how long do you think vaccines development actually take? Just somebody to guess.
20 years.
20 years, thank you. On the average, you have about between 10 to 15 years for vaccines to be developed. But we were saddled with something that we needed to get an answer to right there and then. And so, the next slide that you will see, just sort of, you look at the disease, and then you look at how long it took for the vaccines to be developed, and how long it took for 40% of the global population to be vaccinated. This was not going to work for COVID-19. And so, it was really imperative that people come together, academicians, clinical research organizations, biopharmaceuticals. It was really important for them to come together to develop, these vaccines, basically. And so, as part of the research project that we did, we looked at, what were the strategic alliances that were formed to develop the COVID-19 vaccines. And really, we went to town to look at, how long did this strategic alliance take for them to actually develop the COVID-19 vaccines? And the economic and social impact of it was also what we also considered. So we looked at the various data sets from the research organizations, from the approval organizations, from World Health Organizations, from FDA, from the European medicine agencies. We looked at the various financial data that were available to, talking about, the various institutions, the year-end financial records, and then we compare to see what they were doing before, how they were doing it then, and then what they did afterwards. That was basically what the project looked at. So a quick summary of what we found out. Of all the COVID-19 vaccines that were developed globally, 50 of them were actually approved globally. It's also important to mention the fact that, yes, some countries also have some vaccines that were developed, but when you look at the global scale, looking at vaccines that cut across at least 2 countries, you have 50 of them developed. I'm not sure if any one of us know the 50 of them that were developed. But of course, we are aware of some of them that were developed. The interesting aspect of it was the fact that 62% of these vaccines were developed through strategic alliance. It's unprecedented. Basically, you would have single entity go into the market to develop these vaccines, and that takes time. But of course, with the strategic alliance, we had academic institutions partnering with research organizations, partnering with biopharmaceutical organizations. A typical example of it is what you have in Oxford AstraZeneca vaccines developed. Of course, you also have biopharmaceutical companies collaborating together to develop the COVID-19 vaccines. But unfortunately, that represented a smaller percentage, just about 29% of it. People found it easier to work with academic institutions and biopharmaceutical organizations working together, rather than biopharma and biopharma working together. So that's part of it. And the key strategies some of them deployed were knowledge transfer, licensing agreements, or even joint ventures. But none of them actually had mergers and acquisitions, basically. So, what did we find? For the very first time, we had a shortened timeline to develop the vaccines. 8 months. The first vaccines was developed within 8 months. And that's part of the reasons why we had lower incidence of mortality after these vaccines were actually introduced. In year 2020, 9 COVID vaccines were actually developed. Of 9 of them, 33% of them actually were developed through partnership and collaborations. It's also very important to point out the fact that for the very first time, we had some innovative technology that were being used. A typical example is the development of the COVID-19 vaccines using mRNA technology, unprecedented. And then, of course, if you look at Canada, for example, as at 2023, August, 120 million of those doses of vaccines had been administered in Canada. 80 million of those doses were actually developed through strategic development by various partners, basically. And so, the lessons we could pick up from this is we can't continue to develop, drugs, vaccines like we do in traditional way. People need to collaborate. People need to strategically work together. Strategically working together brings out innovations. And then innovations drives growth, drives quick answers to what we need. In strategically working together, it's also important to point out the fact that organizational reputations play a key role. A lot of us probably might have heard of the GSK Medicago COVID-19 vaccines, Coverance. Why was it not approved globally? If you go back and check, the parent body of Medicago were into producing tobacco. Philip Morris. They were into producing tobacco. In an ethical health situation, you don't want to approve, a company that manufactures something that is considered to be harmful to people's health, encouraging them to go into the health sector producing vaccines. And that's why, except Canada, you probably wouldn't have, GSK Medicago COVID-19 vaccines approved anywhere else. It wasn't approved anywhere else in the world. And so, just to round up, I did put this here. Would mergers and acquisitions have worked in this scenario? I don't think so. Because the bottlenecks that are associated with mergers and acquisitions would have given us a longer time for us to provide a solution to something that we needed right there and now. My special appreciation goes to Dr. Jonas for supervising this work and to some of my teachers that are here. Thank you so much. These are my references.